As society becomes increasingly complex, stress is rising. An overburdened system pushed to the brink by political turmoil, economic uncertainty, and a severe pandemic has subjected the world's populace to record amounts of depression and anxiety. Nowhere has this problem become more acute than in America, where anxiety and depression have reached epic proportions. General anxiety disorder affects nearly 7 million adults, a bit over 3% of the U.S. population. Yet only about 43% of those are receiving treatment. Suicidal ideation continues to increase among adults in the U.S. Nearly 5% of adults report having serious thoughts of suicide.
The biggest problem with depression is that it can get so bad as it completely paralyzes you. It's hard to talk about it to friends or family because they don't understand what it's like unless they've lived it. You don't want to worry people, but at the same time you know you need help, and you have to know when to reach out and how to get that help. That's what I hope this documentary will accomplish.
We've been developing as a human species for thousands of years, but within the last 500 years, we have been bombarded with multiple options, societal pressures to be someone that we're not, and to fit the mold of the psychologically stable person when we know that such a high percentage of us are actually not psychologically stable. The inability to be honest about what's really going on for us internally makes us unhappy because true happiness comes from being our authentic self.
The World Health Organization cites depression as the #1 leading cause of disability, with the cost in human suffering and economic loss reaching staggering proportions. But before we explore the reasons why this has become the hidden epidemic, let's define depression and anxiety.
Well, I think we all suffer from depression and anxiety at some points in our life. Whether it's an actual diagnosable thing that we're dealing with has a criteria of a lot of different things that we look at when we're diagnosing a patient. Depression is like what we all feel. You know, we all feel sad, we all feel down at some points in our life, but that's normal. It's when the depression becomes debilitating and we're not eating, or we're eating too much, we're not sleeping, or we're sleeping too much. We feel like we've lost our energy and our desire to do things that we used to like to do. And it's really a feeling of like, if you don't want to get out of bed or from under the covers, probably something more is going on than just a situational depression.
In general, when we talk about depression and anxiety, we think about mood, and then we also think about fears and being scared. But these two are very distinct but related illnesses.
According to the World Health Organization, depression and anxiety has created a significant economic impact. The estimated cost to the global economy is $1 trillion per year in lost productivity. The incremental economic burden of U.S. adults with major depressive disorder, MDD, was estimated at $210.5 billion in 2010, an increase of 38% over an 8-year study.
Depression and anxiety may be hard to understand. We've all experienced these feelings. It's part of the human experience to feel sad, to feel worried. And so when we're depressed, we usually lose interest in things. We lose energy, our focus goes down, our motivation goes down. Clinically, when this happens for over 2 weeks and it gets in the way of the quality of our life, that's when we define it as a clinical depression.
Depression is a whole body illness. So they feel depressed, sad, angry, irritable. They'll have lethargy and they'll feel so tired and exhausted. They may have trouble thinking. Their memory may be impaired. They might have difficulty sleeping, either sleep too much or sleep too little. They also might feel avoidant. They might feel like they just want to be alone. They don't want to get out of bed. They don't want to socialize with other people. There's so many symptoms to depression, and it can be different for every person.
Some of the symptoms that people experience with depression are a general feeling of sadness in a chronic way. So not like I'm just sad today, I'm feeling down today, but feeling like that ongoing for days and weeks at a time, where you don't enjoy things that you used to enjoy. You just have a general sense of apathy and you don't really want to engage in life. Sometimes people become suicidal because their depression is so bad that they feel like they would rather be dead than be here and have to live life on a daily basis. So if you can think of the worst, absolute worst time in your life, like a death of a parent or a death of a child or a loss of something, how you felt in that moment is usually the way people with clinical depression feel every day.
Well, what it feels like being depressed is it's like a weight, like there's a great weight that's on your shoulders. It's like you're carrying a boulder. Think of the Sisyphus thing of trying to roll the boulder up the hill. It's an excessive weight, and it feels like a psychological pain. And it's so hard to describe to others. And you feel like you're in it by yourself, that there's no one else that can or will understand it. And you feel helpless to do anything about it. And no matter what you do, nothing will change that feeling.
For anxiety, it's a combination of mental worry and physical feelings of panic that really define clinical anxiety. And so if we're excessively worrying about something and that's interfering with our ability to function, our home life, work life, if we get anxiety in the form of physical feelings of panic that interferes with our ability to get out of the house and do things, this is when we start to diagnose clinical anxiety.
I think the easiest way to understand anxiety is to think about when you're feeling really worried and when you're really feeling like you can't stop thinking about a certain situation. It's in your head, it's preoccupying every thought, and you're having a chronic concern about something that doesn't stop. That is more of a chronic form of anxiety than just like if you're feeling anxious about an interview or you're feeling anxious about something that's happening in your life or a date or something like that. It's that times 100 and chronic.
Some of the symptoms that people experience in anxiety can be extremely varied. It's different for every person. So sometimes people with anxiety will get withdrawn and they'll be very quiet. Sometimes they'll get kind of excited and scared. People with anxiety manifest anxiety with more than just a feeling of fear or scaredness. It can be an adrenaline response, like a fight or flight response. They want to run away. They want to curl up into a little ball. They want to avoid things that make them scared or anxious. Sometimes we have normal worries. We might be worried about an upcoming test, for example. We hope we perform very well. But people with anxiety illnesses have anxiety all the time. They really don't understand, or they don't have the experience of not carrying around this worry, this like burdensome worry. It's like a weight that they carry around that they don't want, but it's hard to get rid of.
We don't really fully know the main causes of depression and anxiety. I think that there's a clinical aspect to this and maybe even a genetic aspect that we don't fully understand, like why somebody is going to be more anxious or be more depressed than somebody else. I think what we like to do in therapy is we like to track it back to the origins of somebody's childhood and kind of pull them throughout and see, like, where did these fears first start, or where did the sadness first start, and to really understand the origins. Sometimes there's family chaos. Sometimes there's some kind of a tragedy. Some people develop anxiety or depression just with having a mother who was anxious or depressed. So I think for everybody, it's a little bit different, which is why it's so complex to actually diagnose and look at, because I don't ever look at any two people, any two clients that I see as the same. There's always some uniqueness in their story and in their history and in their childhood that kind of manifests into what's going on with them. So I don't like to generalize it so much and just overdiagnose people as much as like to say some of this is normal. Depression, anxiety, fears, concerns are normal. And I think we've come to the place where we just want to like pop a pill for any time we're feeling sad or any time we're feeling anxious, when really working through these things, you kind of come over to the other side and you realize I don't actually need to just pop a pill for any time I'm feeling anxious. So it's really, you really want to kind of look at the chronicity of it and not jump to taking something to alleviate a feeling that's totally natural and normal.
When it comes to depression and anxiety, there are many contributing factors. And we look to categorize them into 4 different sectors. One is the physical manifestation and contributing factor. And that could just be poor sleep, poor nutrition, poor activity. It could be medical issues like thyroid issues or having different kind of blood levels and illnesses that affect our mental health. Then there's the psychological factors. Those could include past trauma, poor self-image, self-belief. Any of these psychological manifestations could make depression and anxiety worse. Then there's also environmental factors. If we're dealing with financial struggle, if we're dealing with job insecurity, if we have toxic relationships in our lives, all of this can contribute to feelings of depression and anxiety. There's also spiritual factors. Part of humanity is just understanding these questions that we cannot answer in science. Why are we here? What's the point of all this? What happens when we pass? What's the purpose and reason for our existence? I'll also say that we focus many times on the symptoms of depression as almost a downstream effect, and there's a lot of upstream factors. And when we categorize them in the biopsychosocial spiritual model, what we're really looking at is energy states that science doesn't fully understand. And so when our spirit is not aligned, when our energy is not in a state of harmony, the downstream effect is that poor focus, poor energy, excessive anxiety, worry, and sometimes even a numbness and disconnection from our reality. So it's important to understand that these contributing factors, they can happen in the moment, they can have built up over years and decades, and there really is a lot of upstream factors that contribute to downstream anxiety and depression.
Depression also runs in families. There's a huge genetic component to depression, but we cannot understate the importance of environment and situation, because there are triggers that even though you have a vulnerability, a genetic vulnerability to depression, an event, a trauma, a situation, a stressful situation that's overwhelming can trigger those genetics to turn on and get into a depressive episode or an anxious state.
When I was depressed, I felt, numb isn't quite the right word, but it was almost just this void, like my soul should have been in me and it wasn't. It kind of just felt like I wasn't home. And so I was always looking for stimulation in some way to fill that void. So, I always wanted to have music or headphones in. When I was home by myself, I would play endless hours of Candy Crush Saga because it was the only thing that made me feel engaged without having to think a lot, but also it was distracting. And I always wanted the television on, like just something to kind of fill what seemed lacking.
Root causes or triggers resulting in depression or anxiety may include a list of things from substance abuse to childhood trauma and neglect to just poor physical health. There can be acute stressors in our lives, financial concerns, job insecurity, relationship issues. Our concept of self-love, relationships externally begin with our relationship internally. And so if we have low self-esteem, if our self-confidence is low, these can all trigger anxious or depressive states.
It's not enough to say, I have anxiety and start to work on it. You have to be able to say, I have anxiety, this is how it shows up for me, this is why it's an issue for me, and here are the specific things I've learned over time that can help my specific symptoms.
While our society has come a long way toward understanding and helping people affected by mental health issues, barriers still exist. Many struggling with anxiety and depression resist relating to others about their problems out of fear of being stigmatized. As more research is being done, and with a higher awareness of anxiety disorders, more people are opening up and sharing their issues with family and mental care professionals. By the end of 2021, many American adults found themselves anxious and depressed. According to the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey, 47% of adults reported symptoms of anxiety, 39% reported symptoms of depression, and 1 in 5 adults disclosed suffering from a mental illness. It's estimated that less than half of Americans with a mental disorder get adequate treatment. As a result of the fallout created by COVID-19, there are more individuals suffering from depression, anxiety, substance abuse, social isolation, and interpersonal conflicts. In addition, there are more deaths by accidental drug overdose than ever before in our history. Access to health care is impeded by a lack of resources and an underfunded mental health care infrastructure.
We are facing a mental health crisis in America, and I think we do this because for so long, we have had stigma about mental illness, we have avoided mental illness, we haven't really paid much attention to mental illness, so we haven't really treated it, we haven't recognized it within ourselves and in other people. And so now we're at a point where life is so complicated that our mental illness, our mental health is at a critical point.
You know, we had a really rough couple of years with COVID and everything. The isolation that causes really does damage on our brain emotionally and mentally. When we're caught in the same rigid patterns, when we're isolated in our home, when we have financial stress, health fear, all of these things compounded, and I think really exacerbated a problem that was already there, but just really brought it to the nation's attention and highlighted some of the difficulties. It's becoming popular now to address our mental health, and that's exciting and good for our society, and perhaps it took something like a pandemic to raise that attention. But because it hasn't really been focused on, it leaves confusion for many people. What is mental health? How do I improve that? We used to look at it as a weakness. We used to have a lot of stigma around mental health. And now that we're leaning into it, I think enabling people with the education of understanding how they can improve their mental health has been a challenge. And so hopefully we're able to add more education, more understanding, more tools to meet people where they are.
While we know anxiety and depression exist everywhere, the disorders remain hidden in plain sight, leading some experts to call it the hidden epidemic. It's estimated that in the U.S., around 2/3 of all cases of depression go undiagnosed. Left undiagnosed and thus untreated, depression can worsen and significantly diminish quality of life and workplace productivity.
I cannot underscore how big of a problem misdiagnosing depression and anxiety is, because the ultimate problem with depression and anxiety can be suicide or self-harm, which nobody wants anyone that we care about to experience.
The diagnostics of mental illness is a very difficult field to really hone in on. We have to understand that this is a subjective illness that we talk about. When we speak of depression and anxiety, there is no blood test or image of the brain that can define a distinctive diagnosis. With that, we're left with asking subjective questions as objectively as we can. We also rely on patients to understand themselves. Part of the difficulty in mental health is we often don't understand ourselves very well, so to be able to communicate some of what we're going through isn't always the easiest. This leaves practitioners with the challenge of trying to find the right diagnosis, as well as patients with the challenge of understanding their diagnosis and sometimes feeling like maybe they were misdiagnosed. When it comes to depression and anxiety, depression can often be misdiagnosed based on a number of other factors, grief, just medical issues that are conflicting. Anxiety can also be a misdiagnosis from just acute trauma, stress, things in our life that we haven't really dealt with. And so we need to be very clear that diagnostics are broad and not very distinctive. They can be limiting if we try to pigeonhole or categorize somebody too much. Instead, they should be used as just a way of understanding ourselves better, but not a 100% definition of what we're going through.
I was grieving when I was first taken to a psychiatrist, and since I was so young, it's hard to say, like, was I depressed at that point? Did I need help at that point? Or was it just my parents or my mom deciding that and kind of taking me there? But when I was 30 and I had been on antidepressants for 15 years, and I realized that I was having suicidal ideation and that I was still extremely depressed, that was the moment when I said, okay, I need help, but instead of going to a psychiatrist to get on these drugs, I went to a psychiatrist to get off of them because I had spent so long on them and I said, this isn't working, so I need to try something else.
I think misdiagnosis in stress-related disorders can result in people really not knowing where to turn or what to do, meaning to be able to differentiate between normal anxiety, normal fears, what you kind of want to work through in therapy or what you want to just work through in general, versus feeling like there's something wrong with me, or I have this diagnosis and I'm going to have this for the rest of my life, and what am I going to do? You know, people get afraid when they get a diagnosis in general, so it's important to really understand the difference between normal anxiety and a persistent chronic anxiety that's debilitating.
I often get asked if depression and anxiety are a result of chemical imbalance. I don't really like that term. I prefer to think of it as there are chemicals in our brain that are used by neurons to convey one signal to another for us to make decisions and to modulate and regulate our moods. So depression and anxiety are really not so much an imbalance, but maybe there's not quite enough of a neurotransmitter for one nerve to speak to another nerve and make those connections.
Anxiety and depression certainly have a role when it stems from chemical imbalance, but what comes first, the chicken or the egg, I think is the tough component to understand. Because some people do have chemical imbalance that causes their depression, but some people have depressive and anxious habits that cause a chemical imbalance. We are this chemical soup within us, and so to understand which comes first, I think it's an impossible question. We have to really understand it's all related. And when we're anxious or depressed, there might be a chemical imbalance that's caused by other things. And when we're feeling better, our body has the natural ability to achieve homeostasis and improve that chemical equilibrium.
Usually when we see a chemical imbalance, we look at more of a mood disorder like bipolar disorder or a major depressive condition, which can result from a chemical imbalance. It really takes a lot of diagnostic kind of trickery to be able to really tease out exactly what's going on with somebody. And we go through a number of criteria to do that, to make sure that we're actually diagnosing somebody properly. So generalized anxiety is not necessarily a chemical imbalance. Depression, like dysthymia, and more mild depression is not necessarily a chemical imbalance. So we like to really look at a lot of different criteria before we make that determination.
There is a large push in the U.S., both nationally and locally, to identify and treat depression and other mental illnesses. With this growing concern are the large numbers of people who are requesting prescriptions from their family doctor before being properly diagnosed. Most often, these are for drugs they see on television commercials as treatment for depression and anxiety. Many are being misdiagnosed and then misprescribed the wrong medications for the type of disorder they have.
Psychotropic drugs are being prescribed an awful lot in this country. And do we prescribe it too much? I think that we're not prescribing it appropriately, actually, in this country. I don't know if it's too much or too little, frankly, but I think that a really great assessment of what people need needs to occur first. And I see a lot of patients who have gone to a lot of providers and their friends and family and other people, and they come in saying, I have depression or I have anxiety, and they've been prescribed medications for depression or anxiety. But really, what they have is complex PTSD or a bipolar depression, which would take a different kind of treatment, maybe different kinds of medications, and just a whole different approach to their treatment. And they could feel so much better, so much quicker if they were assessed appropriately, diagnosed appropriately, and then treated appropriately.
I think the problem is that people are going to psychiatrists, going to their doctors, and kind of describing depression or anxiety in a situational way, perhaps, and quickly getting put on medication that maybe they didn't need or they could have worked through in therapy first. I think that there's a place for psychotropic medications for sure, but I think that they're just kind of being handed out, in my opinion, like candy.
There's been a very high rate of psychotropics being prescribed in the last few years and decades. And I think it's because it's the major tool that we've learned as psychiatrists in mental health. And it's really been promoted as one of the quickest kind of take this pill and everything's going to get better type of strategies. The evolution of psychotropics, I think, is headed in the right direction. But right now, it's a very new industry. It's only been about 50 years that we've been prescribing psychotropics. And so we are evolving in the way that we're understanding who should be on what medications and who doesn't need to be on medications. And I think we're a little bit early in that education. And so the result is we're just kind of going to the same tool that we know, that we've learned, and pretty soon, hopefully, we'll have a lot more tools and options.
I think it's really important for general practitioners before they prescribe their patients medication to really do a full assessment of what else they're doing to help themselves. Are they in psychotherapy? Are they in their community? Are they engaging in things that would help them with self-care? I think just medication alone is not the answer.
The majority of antidepressants are being written by general practitioners. And this can be difficult for some people because we're not really getting the right mental health evaluation. I think having a subspecialty, seeing a psychiatrist, being able to really understand the full picture will allow the practitioner to understand, is medicine the right choice? Our general practitioners are generally just trying that trial and error approach that we're taught in mental health, where if they notice somebody's having depression or anxiety, we'll start with an antidepressant and then gauge how they're doing afterwards. Hopefully, as we evolve as a specialty, we'll be able to have more of an ability to coordinate who should be on a medication, who doesn't need to, so that we're not overprescribing in general.
A lot of general practitioners prescribe psychiatric medications without sending patients to a full mental health evaluation. I completely disagree with this practice because people are very complicated. Depression is complicated, anxiety is complicated, and there are lots of other mental illnesses to rule out before choosing an antidepressant for depression or anxiety. People deserve to be understood by their mental health practitioner. They deserve more than a 10-minute evaluation. How can anyone even get through the anxiety of speaking to a stranger to tell them what's really going on?
Many older general practitioners are simply not trained in treating anxiety and depressive disorders. Medical schools are beginning to address this shortfall of knowledge by adding coursework designed to recognize stress-related problems in their patients. They're being taught how to recognize the need for referring patients to a mental health practitioner. But in many smaller communities, mental issues are left unchecked or misdiagnosed altogether. Antidepressants of the Prozac generation have been hailed as miracle drugs, and they're a multi-billion-dollar boon to the pharmaceutical industry. But a controversial new study claims that the drugs would do little good for the vast majority of patients who take them. Only in the most severely depressed people do these so-called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, really outperform placebos, according to the paper, which analyzed both published and unpublished studies.
I think people were really excited about Prozac when it first came out because it allowed us not to feel. And people were wanting not to feel depression, anxiety, things like that. So when it came on the scene, it was like, oh, you take this and you feel good. And it worked. You know, it does work to a certain degree. But I think what happened is people would become dependent on it and be on it for years and not really work through the issues that were causing the depression in the first place. And it was just masking. A lot of people, when they're on Prozac or other antidepressants, talk about feeling a little bit numb. And I don't think we want to walk through life feeling numb.
Prozac became very popular in the 1980s when it was introduced because one major reason is that the side effect profile of antidepressants prior to Prozac were pretty bad. They were causing a lot of harm, cardiovascular issues, GI issues, and Prozac came along and said, we can solve this same serotonin deficit problem with much less side effects for some people. Because of that, the marketing really took off and it replaced a lot of the previous antidepressants and allowed people to feel more safe about kind of trying a trial and error medication.
When Prozac was introduced in the 1980s, it was a hit, so popular. And the reason for this is because until then, we didn't have any great antidepressants that did not have terrible side effects. The tricyclic antidepressants were there before, the MAOIs, they all had a lot of workarounds in order for them to work, like dietary restrictions and the potential for high blood pressure. But Prozac came around and it worked and people were happy. They got all sorts of serotonin in their brain. That's why it's so popular.
New studies are shedding light on the efficacy of SSRIs, and it's not the best data, to be honest. What we've understood in the past is that about 1/3 of people on antidepressants get better. 1/3 might feel a little bit of response, and 1/3 don't feel anything at all. This was what we've known traditionally for decades. New data and evidence is showing that only about 10% of people on antidepressants after a year or so continue to have benefit. So there tends to be a little bit of a burnout. And I think we're understanding this more in neuroscience, that the initial momentum and serotonin build is helping people, but over time that burns out and the benefit is dwindling.
The new studies show that Prozac and other SSRIs in relation to placebo are better. It may not be a huge difference between an SSRI and placebo, but there definitely is a difference. And anybody who has been depressed or severely anxious, who has tried an SSRI, will let you know that they did feel better. Most people feel a lot better with the SSRI. When I think about using SSRIs or other antidepressants for the treatment of depression and anxiety relative to other forms of therapy, I think of them as collaborative treatments. The SSRI or antidepressant allows for enough chemical to be in the brain for neurons to talk to each other. Other treatments, such as talk therapy or psychotherapy or CBT or DBT, whole host of other therapies, they stimulate the brain to grow, for neurons to talk to each other and make new pathways in order to regulate and to resolve mood states and anxiety.
While SSRIs can be effective in certain situations, I've found in my practice that there are many other therapies that can be so much more beneficial for our patients. To improve feelings of anxiety and depression, some might need an antidepressant, and that might give them a little stability, but there is much more longer-lasting benefit from psychotherapies, and there's a lot more addressing the root cause of why we're feeling anxious and depressed in general when we explore some of these alternative modalities.
The future for SSRIs is still quite bright. However, there are a lot of other treatments for depression, and there is a big push in society for a quicker treatment than the SSRIs. The SSRIs do take time to work, but they are effective for most people to a pretty significant extent.
I think there's always going to be a place for SSRIs, and I think that people will respond to that, but I think we're looking at a lot of alternative therapies. I think we're looking at holistic therapies. I think we're looking at alternative therapies. I think we're looking at things like ketamine and psychedelics, and all kinds of research is happening on all types of medications, natural and chemical, that could help us with depression and anxiety. And it's just open. I mean, everything is open right now. The research is crazy, booming right now. And I think we're going to find in the next 2 or 3 years that what we thought was the treatment for depression and anxiety is going to be a whole different thing.
Interpersonal therapy is based on the idea that depression can be related to our relationships. The goal of this type of therapy is to help you improve your relationship skills, such as becoming a better communicator and learning how to resolve conflict. Interpersonal therapy sessions are relatively short in duration, usually lasting between 12 and 16 weeks.
Interpersonal therapy is about relieving symptoms and improving interpersonal functioning and effectiveness. So somebody who's trying to reduce their symptoms by interpersonally being in relationships or doing something that would help them to feel less anxious or less depressed.
Treatment in interpersonal therapy generally entails looking at the relationships and interactions in our life and learning more about ourselves because of those. Being able to self-reflect and analyze and understand, why did I react that way towards that person? Why did I have a separate reaction towards a different situation? And that self-reflection, that self-exploration is something then we can continue to try to change and mold and transform. Understanding our strengths and weaknesses as we interact with others allows us to really integrate change where we see needed.
I think the benefits of interpersonal therapy with depression and anxiety is about connection. So we all want to be connected to other people, and if we're improving our interpersonal effectiveness and communication skills and relating to other people, we're not isolated, we're not alone, we feel like somebody relates to us, we feel like somebody is listening to us, and I think it really is about that relationship that can kind of pull us out sometimes of where we're feeling blue or where we're feeling sad. If we're isolated and alone, we're just like alone with our thoughts, alone with our feelings, in our head, kind of feeling like nobody understands.
The benefits of interpersonal therapy over other types of therapy for anxiety and depression include the actual functional improvement in our relationships, in our work life, in our home life. If we can better understand how we're interacting with others and improve upon that, then the quality of our life generally improves. Our relationship with others begins with our relationship with ourselves. And so if we can enhance that self-exploration as it pertains to our interactions, then all of a sudden we're probably feeling better about ourselves, and others feel better about interacting with us as well. The best candidates for interpersonal therapy are those who are willing to admit that they have flaws, that they have weaknesses, and that they're willing to work on those things without any shame, blame, or self-judgment. It's of course also important to be able to have interpersonal relationships that we can analyze. And so someone who really is committed to improving the quality of their relationships is a great candidate for ITP.
I think really anybody is a candidate for interpersonal therapy. I mean, who doesn't want to have an interpersonal relationship with another person or improve their interpersonal skills? Like, we all kind of need to do that on some level. So I think it would be somebody who really is struggling in that regard in terms of relationships, in terms of, understanding how their patterns are in relationships and improving that overall. I mean, I think we could all benefit from that.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is a form of talk therapy designed to help you change any negative thought or behavior patterns that might be contributing to or worsening your depression. This therapy is also generally short-term and focuses on your current problems and learning new coping skills.
Cognitive behavioral therapy challenges us to examine the way we think and the way we behave in order to affect the way we feel. And so it is very difficult to change our emotional state. If you're upset or sad, all of a sudden someone says, be happy. Even a monk probably can't achieve that. But the path towards getting there is to examine the way we're thinking, the way we're behaving. And if we can change those things, then as a result, the way we feel emotionally can improve.
Cognitive behavioral therapy is really dealing with thought patterns. That's kind of the most simple way to say it. So we often will have faulty thought patterns based on our experiences or based on what we've seen or what we've learned over time. And we tend to think in a certain way that may or may not be distorted. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a way for the therapist to really challenge those thoughts and have you look at things in a different way that you might not have thought of before. So as you change your thought patterns, the idea is that your behavior, your emotionality, things like that will get uncovered in a way that can also change. So if you're thinking something that you've thought your whole life and you think, well, I think this, so it must be true, and the therapist is saying, well, let's look at this a different way. Let's see if we can see this from a different angle. And you start to change the way you think about the same exact thing, then it becomes the new pattern.
In the early 1900s, many psychologists, philosophers really started to understand that there are different ways of approaching the human psyche. And analyzing our thoughts, analyzing our behaviors in order to affect the way we feel, this is something that Sigmund Freud and many others pioneered in the early 1900s. CBT is a large umbrella of different therapy modalities that have evolved drastically over the last century.
Cognitive behavioral therapy was developed in the 1960s by Dr. Aaron Beck. And he was really looking at our cognitions and cognitive distortions and really seeing in different therapy and through his research the thought process that was going into it, which was kind of different than the psychoanalytic that had come before him. And he really found some interesting things about how we distort our cognitions and ways to kind of help that process in a different way than just dealing with our unconscious, dealing with our emotions. He really started looking at our thoughts.
Cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective for anxiety and depression because no matter of our external situation, if we can control our thoughts and behaviors in response to external stressors, then we can be in a state of peace and happiness. And so with CBT, we're given the tools to be able to process and reframe any difficult situation we're in and be able to see things from a more empowering perspective.
When people are depressed and when they're anxious, usually they get stuck in a thought pattern that they can't get out of. They feel like they can't get out of it. So if they're changing their thoughts about certain things, like meaning we all tend to be negative at some point, right? We have negative self-talk. When you're depressed or anxious, the negative self-talk is looping in a way that we feel like we can't stop it. So if we kind of put a cog in that wheel and help people to see like there's a different way to think about this, then they start to change their patterns of thinking and then they start to feel better.
Social skills training teaches you how to interact with others more effectively so you can have healthy relationships. The goal is to improve your communication skills and to learn how to build a strong social network with others by creating relationships based on honesty and respect.
Social skills training is often used with children who suffer from depression, anxiety, autism, and ADHD because their childhood is so focused on developing socially. It's part and parcel of their brain development and their emotional development. Social skills training offers these children a chance to learn how to develop and how to interact with other people and gain all of that developmental stimulation for their brain to grow.
Social skills training involves the ability for someone to improve their daily life skills, their ability to improve their interpersonal relationships, the way that they interact with their environment. It's a really important part of our mental health growth because our social and environmental factors really contribute to our mental and emotional health. So the ability to understand how can I improve my social health should not go overlooked when we're improving our therapeutic growth. Often, depression and anxiety stem from a difficulty acclimating to our social climate. It causes people to isolate at home, causes people to avoid going out. So to be able to improve our social skills, to be able to get out of our house, out into society, all of a sudden we'll feel less anxious and less depressed.
Psychodynamic therapy is the type of therapy often portrayed in movies or pop culture. During these therapy sessions, you learn how your depression may be related to past experiences, unresolved conflicts, or unhealed wounds. The therapist will help you address these issues so you can move forward in your life.
Psychodynamic psychotherapy is a highly effective treatment for depression and anxiety because it takes a deep look into ourselves and how we relate to other people. It's almost like a second step treatment after CBT. It takes that deep dive into ourselves and affects our depressive symptoms and our anxiety symptoms, and we learn how to cope and resolve those symptoms.
Psychodynamic therapy involves reflecting on all of the experiences and interactions we've had in our life, being able to draw patterns, understand ourselves better so that when we see habits and patterns that don't serve us, we can enact change. When we notice strengths, we can lean into those and build those up as well.
Psychodynamic therapy is really looking at the unconscious drives and looking at the kind of the underneath, what's really going on in our subconscious and our unconscious that drives us to do the certain things that we do and how we are. And it really stems back to childhood. And that's really what Sigmund Freud was looking at how the child developed over time and what the unconscious drives were to do all of the things that we do. And it's an in-depth talk therapy that looks at the unconscious.
The origins of psychodynamic therapy come from psychoanalytic therapy, which we all think of Freud when we think of psychoanalysis. But psychodynamic psychotherapy is the modern version, the applicable version of psychoanalysis.
The origins of psychodynamic therapy date back to the 1900s. Carl Jung had a lot of impact in our understanding of how we can relate to the parts of ourselves that we don't like. When we look back at our experiences, our interactions, and what he refers to as the shadow self is that part of us that might show up under stress, might show up as a defense mechanism. And so this understanding has evolved greatly over the last century to be able to help people show up as their best version.
Psychodynamic therapy started by Dr. Sigmund Freud in the 1890s, and he was looking at the unconscious mind and how our unconscious plays out in our everyday lives through in-depth psychoanalytic therapy, and really focused on the relationship between the psychoanalyst or the therapist and the patient, and the relationship and everything that would kind of come up as a result of that relationship.
Psychodynamic psychotherapy is effective for treating depression and anxiety because it takes a deep dive into what is most important to us. And that typically is our relationships with other people and with ourselves.
I think psychodynamic therapy is an effective form of therapy for depression and anxiety because if we're looking at our unconscious drive and our childhood issues, we can understand over a period of time where the pattern emerged, how it started, what is kind of like the underbelly of what goes on and how we tick. So I think it's important to first understand it, which is really what psychoanalytic theory is, like understanding who we are, why we do the things that we do, and then to use some other forms of therapy to actually change the behavior. But to first understand it, I think it's effective for sure.
Sometimes the origin of depression or anxiety is an inner angst that we have with ourselves. And so if we can understand ourselves and those parts of us that we don't like, and we're able to love those parts, explore those parts, nourish those parts, help those parts grow, then we can show up as our best self, and often those anxious and depressive patterns are overcome by our truer self.
Family or couples therapy may be considered when depression affects others in the household. This involves looking at each of your roles and expectations. This type of therapy also involves educating your loved ones about depression and how it affects you.
There's a number of different family theoretical models that people use when they're addressing families. The thing that I like to do when I'm meeting with families is work on communication. And I like that people are in their own therapy because when you kind of come into a room and it's a family and everyone's got their own issues, everyone wants to kind of put their own issues out there to the therapist, and the therapist can't really do individual therapy with a number of different family members, right? So it's important that we say, in family therapy, what are we working on here versus what are we working on in individual? If we're working on here the family system, then we want to look at how the family is communicating with each other. Who's the most vocal? Who gets the most attention? Who gets kind of put on the back burner? And let's address the actual dynamic of the family as a whole as opposed to each individual person. So one of the first things that I do when I have a couple or a family in the room is I clarify, what do you expect from this process? Do you expect that the other person is going to do what you want? Do you expect that things are going to change in the family? Like, what are your core expectations of this? Because each person is going to have a very different understanding and idea of what they want. And so if it's very clear from the beginning, then we can at least address, is this realistic? Is this something that can happen? Does each person need to go to their own therapist to deal with their own stuff? And like, what is the main goal? And we have to kind of communicate that amongst each other so that we can come to a common goal of what that family therapy is going to look like. Because if everybody's on the same page as to what the expectation is and the outcome is going to be, we can all work together toward that. If everybody's expectation is different, which is kind of the con, then it can just blow up in the room. Everybody's angry, everyone's mad, nobody feels understood, nobody feels listened to, and sometimes it can actually create more problems.
Family therapy and couples therapy is a very important type of therapy when one feels depressed or anxious. And this is because we are social beings and we do not exist outside of our relationships with other people. So to address it in therapy, to resolve those issues and problems and feel better about them affects our mental state. It can be extremely challenging because it requires that all members of a family or a couple examine themselves. It's much easier to blame issues on one person. But when you enter into a couples therapy or a family therapy, it highlights issues that the family or the couple may have kept hidden, but are essential for the treatment of depression and anxiety.
Family or couples therapy involves improving communication in those relationships that are most important to us. To be able to start from a place of love, empathy, and understanding, all of a sudden a lot of the stressors that we may hold in those relationships start to dissipate because we're focusing more on growth-oriented work. We're focusing on transparent and honest communication, and we're releasing a lot of the resentment, anger that we might hold within those relationships. There are some pros and cons to family and couples therapy. The pros are many. Being able to advance communication, love, understanding, empathy across those relationships, being able to improve toxicity in our social life. All of this can really help with anxiety and depression. Some of the disadvantages are that we may be ready for this support, but the others in the dynamic are not. And so if our partner or our family member isn't ready to work on growth and try to improve the relationship, it becomes a very one-sided dynamic. And often there's less progress and sometimes even more harm or resentment that fosters from that.
I think when you're doing family or couples therapy, we're not really looking at addressing an individual's depression and anxiety per se. However, being able to communicate and being able to have that interpersonal connection and improve the communication with people that you love or people that you're close to might actually make you feel more relief, might make you feel better about your interpersonal relationships. So in that sense, it could then trickle to the depression lifting or the anxiety lifting. Just being able to communicate how you're feeling can sometimes lift these things.
Staying in the moment of now is an important part of thought management because we have both conscious and unconscious parts of our brain. When we are consciously focusing on something, aka bringing our awareness to the present moment, we are activating certain aspects of our brain and our mind. When we aren't consciously focusing, a part of our brain called the default mode network begins to be activated. Now, this mode network is specific in referencing things that have happened in our past and then placing those on stories of our future to keep us safe.
Belief systems play an important role in developing and maintaining our sense of well-being and contentment. Our sense of belonging and being a part of a tribe is built into our DNA. Therefore, our belief systems tend to coincide with how we're brought up, how we are taught, and how we learn to integrate into our immediate society. Political, religious, and cultural beliefs, as well as customs, are strongly influenced by those around us. These belief systems are integral to how we integrate our self-concept and identity to the world around us. When those feelings, beliefs, and ideologies conflict, cognitive dissonance occurs, which can result in anxiety and depression. Because our beliefs are easily manipulated and are strongly reinforced by those who surround us, such as family, friends, and trusted resources, it's easy to see how inner conflicts can take hold. Critical thinking is imperative to fighting cognitive distortions. Errors in judgment and cognitive distortions are often the cause of our anxiety and depression. Because our minds are quick to jump to unreasonable conclusions, researchers in behavioral analysis stress the importance of critical thinking and reality checking as a way of countering runaway fears and thoughts.
I think our belief system is crucial in terms of what we think or believe about ourselves. And I think that nowadays with social media and with looking down at our phone at Instagram and seeing all these pictures or all these people that look like they have perfect lives or whatever it is that we're viewing is actually not helpful to our belief system, especially with young people nowadays growing up and thinking they have to be perfect, they have to look a certain way, they have to be a certain way, when really we're seeing something that's kind of an illusion and it's not based in reality. So I think getting back to the basics and grounding kids in really feeling like you are worthy just for being a person, just for being alive, just for being you is so critical. And we're kind of battling this huge thing that is social media in a way that doesn't allow kids to kind of develop and grow their belief system based on who they are, what they're doing, their family, but more this huge entity of craziness that has like really influenced us and adults too, not just kids.
The beliefs that we hold create our reality, and therefore if we can understand what contributes to our belief system, if we can deconstruct that, if we can bring our ego into awareness and manipulate it in a way where our beliefs are more in harmony with what we really want, then all of a sudden we'll feel better emotionally and mentally. Our belief systems are a very powerful tool to be able to understand and manipulate in order to improve our mental and emotional health.
Our belief systems are at the foundation of how we experience all life situations. And depression and anxiety are completely influenced by our belief systems. By changing our belief systems or making them more positive, we can affect our depression and anxiety symptoms in a healthy way.
The easiest way to do a reality check if you're feeling self-conscious or you're feeling like somebody is thinking something about you or someone is, kind of not really telling you what they really think is to ask. And if they don't tell you, you need to assume that it's not the case. So we're always thinking a million things in our head about everybody that walks by us at any given time. And as somebody is looking at you, you automatically think, oh, they must be thinking about me. But the truth is, we're very self-absorbed. We're usually thinking about ourselves and what we're going to eat for dinner or where we're going to go next. And we could just be looking at somebody thinking something about ourselves, but they might think, oh, why are they looking at me? So unless it's actually something that's being directed towards you, like somebody saying, I don't like you, don't assume it.
When we're going through an anxious or depressive thought pattern, it is important to do some reality checking. This may involve talking to loved ones, talking to a professional, journaling your feelings, expressing things that you might be holding in, which give you a skewed perspective about whatever that belief is. All of a sudden, you're able to interact with others, open up new perspectives, and perhaps start to realize that whatever thought or belief you're holding on to doesn't need to be so rigid. And that flexibility allows us to really be more open-minded, to not be so self-critical or perhaps critical of the world around us.
For people with depression and anxiety, doing reality checks is very important because we do carry around those negative beliefs like, people don't like me, I'm not pretty, I'm too fat, I'm not smart. These are all beliefs that are simply not true. We can just simply ask ourselves, am I really not smart? And then remind ourselves of all the times that we were smart or that we were successful or that we could complete something that we didn't think that we could. When dealing with worries and anxiety, we often come up with scenarios in our head that are not necessarily valid, accurate, or true. So what we can do is ask ourselves, is this likely to happen? Is it likely that what I really want, I won't be able to get, or that I'm going to fail at something? We might fail at something, we might get disappointed, but we might also be okay with those scenarios. One trick that people can use to think about their depression and anxiety and to make it better is to consider their depression or their anxiety as an unwanted friend who just won't go away. And the more you try to get rid of your depression or get rid of that anxiety, the harder it gloms onto you. So one trick would be to accept it and say, okay, you're my friend. You want to be my friend. Let's be friends. Help me. And that friend can be your best friend because anxiety and depression tells us a lot about what we need and what we can do to help ourselves.
I think it's important when you're feeling worried or anxious to try as much as possible to stay in the present. So if you're thinking about the future, if you're thinking about the past, you're not in the present, you can't control anything in the future or the past. So for anxious people, I like to do exercises with them about staying in the present. So mindfulness, guided meditation, things that actually keep you connected to your mind and body in the moment, because really, at the end of the day, that's all we have.
Another tool is to ask yourself, if you were to give this advice to someone else, how would you give that advice? Often we are the biggest judgers of ourselves. We have a lot of self-blame, a lot of shame. But if we look at the same situation through the eyes of a loved one, perhaps we're giving advice to a friend, a child, it generally opens our heart and takes away a lot of the self-criticism. That way, we're able to see things more objectively, with less of an anxious or depressive filter.
Our thoughts and feelings influence our perception of reality. Our thoughts and feelings arise from our life experiences, our belief systems, our negative feelings, our positive feelings, our false beliefs, and things that people have said to us through the years that for some reason we believe but may not be accurate. So It is our reality because that's what we live in. However, it's changeable and not the whole story.
Our thoughts and feelings are an accurate reflection of our own reality, but is our own reality somebody else's reality, right? So like, how do we even really know? I think the way that we know is by checking it out with someone. So like, this is a really good reason to be in therapy, to check things out. Because if you're checking something out with your friend or a loved one or a family member, there's a pre-existing relationship there that's not objective or kind of neutral, and you might get a response that might be different than somebody that's really objective, neutral, and is trained to do this. So I think everybody can benefit from therapy, even if it's just to kind of process through certain thoughts or feelings that we are wondering about. Is this reality?
Our thoughts and feelings are not an accurate reflection of reality. Reality, in fact, is very subjective. And if you think about the way that we perceive our reality, it's through a neurochemical, electromagnetic field that we just don't fully understand. We are not our thoughts. We are not our feelings. And in fact, the brain is the only organ in our body we can think our way into changing. So if we recognize symptoms or patterns that don't align with us, we have the ability to change those things and create a new reality for ourselves.
When I was depressed, I felt like everybody else around me was breathing and I was drowning. Right? I felt like I couldn't connect with anybody. I felt like I was speaking a foreign language, maybe, that nobody could understand me, that my problems were the biggest problems in the world, that nobody else is going through, what I'm going through, and that everything was almost... The more things that would trigger or get worse, it was like, when is this going to end? I'm never going to feel better. I'm never going to be loved, or I'm never going to love myself, and I'm not worthy. And why am I waking up? Like, why am I even trying anymore? And I think that was when we started having those thoughts over and over and over again. I was digging myself into this hole where it was just getting worse and worse and worse.
When I was depressed, I remembered thinking to myself that, wow, I can actually understand the kind of low, the amount of pain that somebody is dealing with or feeling, to the point of where you actually think about suicide. And you think about, oh, like, wow, I can really understand that kind of a low, the amount of pain somebody's dealing with. And that scared me. That was a terrifying thought, knowing that I would never actually, do anything to harm myself. Just the thought of understanding the low and that level of pain to get to that point was terrifying.
I can remember as a child feeling intense feelings of sadness that always seemed to be with me. It seems I've always had feelings of anxiety and depression. My father also suffered from bouts of debilitating depression. He was suicidal as well as an alcoholic. My mother was also an alcoholic. Both of them were functional and were able to hold down jobs, but their problems worsened. Their outcomes were not good.
When I first realized I was depressed, I was in a sort of state of denial about it. I was trying to still tell myself that I was fine, and I was trying to distract myself or numb myself with whatever it was that I could think of, whether it's watching hours and hours of TV so that I don't just have to sit there with myself, or, taking a medication to just kind of take away whatever it was that I was feeling. And it was a really interesting and scary and just very weird point in time of my life.
Over the last 20 years, there's been promising research with classic psychedelics, the pharmacological class of compounds that include psilocybin, an ingredient found in so-called magic mushrooms. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, psilocybin can produce perceptual changes, altering a person's awareness of their surroundings and of their thoughts and feelings. Treatment with psilocybin has shown promise in research settings for treating a range of mental health disorders and addictions. Studies by Johns Hopkins medicine researchers have shown that psychedelic treatment with psilocybin relieved major depressive disorder symptoms in adults for up to a month. Researchers report that the substantial antidepressant effects of psilocybin-assisted therapy given with supportive psychotherapy may last at least a year for some patients.
I think there's a lot we still don't know about psychedelic treatment that we're finding out. I think right now there's somewhere like in the realm of 50 research studies being done. And there's a lot of really good documentaries that are being done on it and really interesting stuff that we're finding. I think it's going to be the wave of the future. And I think the one thing that's the most important about psychedelic treatment and all of these alternative therapies is that you do it in a controlled way under professional supervision.
Psychedelics have contributed immensely to the treatment and understanding of anxiety and depression. If you think about it, the ability to enhance self-exploration, in some ways, psychedelics are to psychiatry what the microscope was to biology. We're able to look deeper within the soul, the psyche, the ego, all of these abstract constructs, and allow people to really be their own healer, to be their own therapist, to understand what's going on a subconscious level, bring that up to their conscious mind, and be able to reflect and impact change where they see fit.
Psychedelics have been experimented with in psychiatric treatment for many years, decades actually, and now we're looking at it again for the treatment of depression and anxiety. There is some promise, but the evidence isn't solid.
So I think ketamine is an effective form of treatment for depression and anxiety, and I've had a lot of clients report very positive results that they didn't necessarily get with other traditional therapies or medication. The only thing that I would say is that we don't want to think of it as like a quick fix. We want to also make sure that people are doing it in conjunction with therapy, that it's not just the ketamine that they're using to kind of come out of the depression. They're still looking at the underlying issues. They're still looking at processing what were the origins of the depression in the first place. Because again, we don't want to get into where, oh, we're depressed, let's just do ketamine, in a doctor's office and we're going to be all better. It doesn't really work like that. It's definitely a jump start, but it's not the only thing that somebody should do.
Ketamine has really innovated the way that we treat anxiety and depression. It's one of the newest mechanisms of action in the psychopharmacology of psychiatry. What we're seeing is that it's improving the brain's ability to create new connections, new neural connections, what we call neuroplasticity. It's contributing to the ability of the brain to create new neural pathways, to get out of our rigid, set mode we call the default mode network. We all have this kind of background process in our brain. We think, feel, do the same things over and over, and they live in our default mode network. These connections when, for example, we might be driving to work. A minute goes by, we might be texting, and we realize, I didn't even know I was actively driving. It's that background default mode network that takes over. What happens when there's an obstruction on your path, and all of a sudden you need to make a detour? All of a sudden that default mode network relinquishes control, and we're more in our proactive mind. Ketamine is similarly doing this. It's creating a way to surpass the detours in our mental blocks and see new perspectives, to be able to branch out and really find the filter of life that we can change rather than just certain chemicals that we're focusing on.
Ketamine is being used more widely now for the treatment of depression and anxiety. People are getting ketamine infusions, and they're getting ketamine via a nasal spray. There is some promise, but the evidence is not robust at this time.
Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, is a non-invasive form of brain stimulation in which a changing magnetic field is used to cause electric current at a specific area of the brain through electromagnetic induction. An electric pulse generator, or stimulator, is connected to a magnetic coil, which in turn is connected to the scalp. The stimulator generates a changing electric current within the coil, which induces a magnetic field. This field then causes a second inductance of inverted electric charge within the brain itself. TMS has shown diagnostic and therapeutic potential in the central nervous system with a wide variety of disease states in neurology and mental health, with research still evolving. It's shown promise in the treatment of depression and anxiety.
TMS is very interesting, and I think that people are really excited about TMS because clients, patients are reporting vast improvement in their anxiety and depression after a series of TMS treatment. And although I don't perform TMS myself, what the feedback that I'm getting about clients who are experiencing this is very promising and very exciting for the future.
Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, is a hopeful new treatment for depression and anxiety. One caveat to using it is that the evidence is kind of 50-50. 50% of people respond and 50% of people don't. Also, I would like to note that the effectiveness of TMS is largely due to the complexity of the machine. So the older models are not that effective for the treatment of depression. The newer models actually go deeper in the brain and are showing some promising hope for the treatment of complex anxiety disorders such as obsessive compulsive disorder.
Optogenetics, a technique developed in the early 2000s, has proved effective in the study and treatment of depression and depression-like behaviors, and has revolutionized already known experimental techniques. This technique employs light and genetic tools to either inhibit or excite specific neurons or pathways within the brain. Teletherapy is any remote therapy that uses technology to help the therapist and client communicate. Some examples of teletherapy include doing therapy sessions over the phone, having a group chat for group therapy, using video conferencing for individual, couples, or group therapy, receiving therapy via email or instant messenger. The therapeutic process for teletherapy is similar to in-person therapy. It usually begins with a few initial sessions during which the therapist and client get to know one another and discuss treatment goals. After that, the therapist may dig more deeply into the client's issues, make recommendations for behavioral changes, and encourage the client to reflect on their emotions.
Some of the benefits of teletherapy is that it allows for people who might not have been able to access certain kind of therapies that they can now. I think that, being in the comfort of your own home and feeling like you can just call your therapist and get that support from home is a positive. I think for me, I personally like to at least see somebody in person a few times before I get on a teletherapy situation, because I like to see people's reactions in person and their comfort level and the anxiety and all of what you can actually see in the office versus when they're in the comfort of their own home. It's definitely different, but I think there are benefits and some issues with it.
I have been using teletherapy for over a year, and I love it. I find that it's convenient for patients, it's convenient for me, and I can see a lot more people at different times. So sometimes I'll see patients in the evening, and sometimes I'll see them early morning Saturday or in between some of my child's social events. I feel that teletherapy offers increased access to treatment and convenience.
I don't think teletherapy is suited to treating depression and anxiety over other therapies necessarily. I think people are kind of getting too comfortable staying in their house, and I think part of kind of getting out and having interaction with a human being is important to lifting the depression, to lifting the anxiety. We want people to feel a little bit uncomfortable when they're doing therapy. If you're just like kicking back at your house and you're totally comfortable, you might not deal with some of the things that are creating the anxiety or creating the depression by getting out and actually having human contact.
Teletherapy may not be better than other treatments for depression and anxiety, but teletherapy offers more access to treatment, and more access to treatment is helpful. Some people are very comfortable with it because they're in their safe place, like their home, and not in a therapist's office. So teletherapy kind of puts the traditional view of therapy in a therapist's office on a blank slate and free association kind of in question. But the evidence shows that the teletherapy platform is just as effective for the treatment of depression and anxiety as in-person.
I think that depression and anxiety is something that we all have. And I think that to treat it from a holistic standpoint is critical. We really need to look at each person as an individual with their own unique issues and address each person accordingly. So what might work for one person is not going to work for somebody else. It's very individual, but I think it's critical to not just have one form of treatment, to really look at the person's individual needs, what is creating the depression and anxiety to begin with, addressing those things from a holistic perspective. So mind, body, spirit is important. If you're doing that and you're balancing it all, you're really going to see results. I think any one thing, any one pill, any one treatment, if someone's trying to kind of sell you on one thing and they don't know you or they don't know what your issues are, be suspect.
Of all the treatment options available for anxiety and depression, I feel that psychedelic medicine really shows the most promise. It is shifting the way that we understand mental health. Psychiatry has in many ways been broken for the past 40, 50 years, where we're trying our best to help our patients and our patients are trying their best to listen to their doctor's advice. But this let's diagnose a disease and let's pick a pill to treat it, this model hasn't been working as efficiently as we've hoped. Psychedelics are shifting this. Instead of diagnosing a disease state, we're just telling everybody we all have a mental health journey and it requires more self-exploration. And the goal is not to find the right treatment for the right problem, but instead to be able to find harmony and balance in places of our life that are in discord, that are in conflict. Psychedelics give us that power to be our own healer, to be our own therapist, to be able to add that equilibrium in parts of our life that we know need more attention.
There are many treatments for depression and anxiety. I cannot single out one treatment as the best. The best treatment for depression and anxiety is a combination of treatments: medication, talk therapy, group therapy, family therapy, couples therapy. At least two of those together would be the best treatment.
Although research shows great promise for the future of treating anxiety and depression, much is still unknown. While the psychiatric community and the pharmaceutical companies have long touted bringing mental disorders into the same fold as physiological illnesses, the exact causes for depression and anxiety continue to baffle both researchers and clinicians. It is for this reason a greater emphasis is being placed on prevention.
I think the most important thing is self-care. And I know this is kind of a buzzword now, and I'm not talking about baths and, bubble baths and candles. I'm talking about real self-care. So attending to your mind, body, and spirit in a holistic way all the time, not just when you're depressed, not just when you're anxious, but every day, some kind of practice, whether it's meditation, exercise, talking to another human being, getting off the screen time, working on things in therapy to better yourself. Every single day, you need to have some kind of a self-care practice put into place. Don't wait until things get bad.
There are many preventative practices to get ahead of any anxious or depressive patterns. These might include just taking care of your physical health. The number one thing is sleep hygiene. We know that when we're not getting good sleep, our mental health really suffers. Nutrition, avoiding inflammatory foods, increasing cardiovascular exercise. The body and mind are all connected. And when we nourish the body, all of a sudden our mind is in a healthier place, and that can prevent anxious and depressive patterns. Further, it's important to look at our environmental health and try to improve any factors that are causing clutter, toxicity, that are making us feel not our best self because we're waking up and living in that environment every day.
Practice basic self-care, nutrition, exercise, sleep, paying attention to your relationships, taking a look at past experiences, understanding how they affect you, and letting go of guilt and shame. And if it's hard to do that on your own, get help. Understanding yourself, getting help, relying on other people, all of that helps us not get into another depressive episode or an anxious attack or anxious episode?
I think prevention is key in terms of helping yourself to constantly be growing and working on your issues. We all have issues. We can all benefit from therapy. It's not to wait until things get bad to seek help. Obviously, if you do that, you can get help, but prevention is key, just like with any thing that you suffer with, right? So if you don't wait until you get sick necessarily to take vitamins. It's the same thing with therapy. Why not start to work on yourself in therapy before it gets to a point where you're so depressed or you're so anxious or things are so debilitating that you can't function?
It's never too early to contact help if you're suffering with anxious or depressive patterns. We all have a mental health journey. I firmly believe that we should all have a professional to be able to talk to enhance self-exploration, to look at therapeutic tools that we can improve our life with. So if you're having any thoughts, concerns, self-doubts, please reach out. Find someone to connect with. It's never too early.
The best time to contact help is as soon as you need it. Whenever you feel depressed or sad or dysphoric or anxious or challenged, reach out to other people. There's no reason to go through anything on your own. There's always somebody there to help you. There's a lot of stigma attached to asking for help, especially for mental illness. But that's even more the reason for asking for help. There are so many professionals out there who simply want to help other people.
Depression is part of the human experience. However, when we classify it as a disorder, that means it's taken a toll on our functional quality of life. Some might have a genetic predisposition to depression, but in order to prevent the manifestation, we could just practice having a clear body, mind, and soul, making sure that we have good balance in our life, that our relationships are in order, that we're feeling aligned with any conflicts, we're addressing them appropriately, being able to take self-inventory and enact change. These are the ways of getting ahead of our mental health and trying to prevent any manifestation, even if we have the genetic predisposition.
One would think that we could prevent depressive disorders, but there is a huge genetic component to depression. Depression is a whole body illness. It has a biological basis and a psychological basis. So understanding that, accepting our vulnerability to having a depressive episode can help us mitigate the symptoms of depression, maybe be aware of a depressive episode coming on and getting help sooner. But to think that we can prevent all depressive episodes, I think puts too much pressure on us. These are illnesses. We can't prevent colds. So how do we prevent a depressive episode?
I think excessive cell phone use and texting can contribute to depression and anxiety just in terms of the isolative nature of what that is, right? We need human contact. We need to have contact with other people. We need to communicate. We need to enjoy ourselves with people. So the more isolated we are, which is what that is, the more we're going to be depressed and anxious. It's really common sense.
Excessive cell phone use and electronics certainly contributes to depression and anxiety. In fact, I believe it is one of the biggest culprits of the decline of our society's mental health. We're all becoming cyborgs. We're attached to our phone, we're attached to our electronics, and there are many reasons why this is chemically affecting us. One is dopamine desensitization. What we're realizing is we're getting this quick fix, this quick rush of dopamine. And every time we have that text, that video, that email, that ding, it gives us a rush in our body. In the past, we used to have delayed gratification. You work hard and you find the fruits of your labor after hours, days, or even weeks. This was a much more natural way for our body to manifest the reward process of dopamine. When we're stuck to our phones, when we're stuck to our electronics, we're also missing out on being present in our daily life. Our mind is in another place. It's in that article, it's in that conversation. And part of getting past anxiety and depression is to be more present in our lives. When we're too focused on the past, we get depressed. When we're too focused on the future, we get anxious. Electronics have interfered with our ability to detoxify from these unhealthy thought patterns. It will be so beneficial if we can get to a point where digital detox is part of our normal life, where that becomes part of mental health treatment. Understanding that the disconnection from some of this technological advancement really will help nourish our growth.
Social media plays a huge role in all of our lives and affects our depressions and our anxieties. A lot of people who are depressed or who have low self-esteem will go to social media to improve their self-esteem, but we can't predict what we're going to see on social media. Sometimes social media will be supportive, and sometimes it won't. And unfortunately, when we're in states of depression or anxiety, we may misunderstand and take those likes or dislikes to heart and make our depression or anxiety worse.
I think alcohol, caffeine, and nicotine can contribute to depressive and anxiety conditions in the sense of alcohol is a depressant. So where people might drink to feel like they want to numb out their feelings or because they're depressed, it actually creates more depression because it's a depressant. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense. Nicotine makes us anxious. We smoke or we use nicotine to calm ourselves down, and that's the lie that nicotine tells us, is that that's what it's doing, but then we withdraw from it and need more, which creates more anxiety. So again, it's that kind of lie that we tell ourselves that, if I just smoke a cigarette, if I just have a drink, I'll calm down. It's really the opposite of that.
Alcohol, tobacco, nicotine, caffeine, a lot of these normalized drugs in our society have certainly contributed to our societal mental health. If you think back in history, alcohol's origins were really our main way of hydrating and preventing any kind of toxicity in water and preventing illness and infection. All of a sudden, alcohol was replaced by tea, and we were boiling water to get rid of impurities and toxins, and then all of a sudden, caffeine became prominent in society. If you look at the shift, when we were all drinking more alcohol, we were working in the field. It was labor-intensive. As soon as caffeine took over society, we became much more productive. The Industrial Revolution started to take over, and the capacity to work hard became easier. What this has done for society is causing this really high-pressure burnout from working so hard, feeling like we need to be dependent on these stimulants like caffeine and nicotine. And so no matter what those substances are, the more we normalize them within society, we're going to see residual effect, both positive and negative in some ways, but if we do it without intention, more so we get the negative outcomes.
Alcohol, caffeine, and nicotine do influence depression and anxiety. Alcohol is a depressant and can cause depression or make depression worse. In the short term, alcohol might seem like it helps anxiety, but actually it does nothing to help long-term symptoms of anxiety. Caffeine can wake people up, but not necessarily help with anxiety because a lot of people do feel even more anxious when they take too much caffeine.
I think most people don't realize that the more we talk negatively to ourselves, the more we believe what we're saying. So, it sounds kind of like, a little cheesy, but doing positive self-affirmations, sticking little Post-its up on your mirror and saying you love yourself or something positive about yourself every day, you actually begin to believe it, just like we believe the negative self-talk and we believe the negative criticism that came to us from other people. So we kind of ingrain that into our beings. And so think about that. If you just say, I love myself, I'm beautiful just the way I am, or whatever it is that you feel comfortable saying, you eventually start to believe it. Just like a vision board, just like guided meditation, we can actually calm our nervous system. We can actually change our thoughts. We can actually love ourselves just from a few phrases a day.
Managing negative self-talk and rumination can be very difficult. But if we approach it through alternative angles, rather than just to try to change the self-talk, which can be very difficult, instead let's do some breathing techniques. Let's find relaxation in the body. Let's become more active. Let's change our scenery. If we can change our physical state, all of a sudden we can more effectively change our thought patterns. Further, when we have a lot of negative self-talk and ruminations, we're more in a passive mindset. To be more present, to practice things like meditation, and be more of the observer of our thoughts rather than the passenger experiencing the thoughts, this allows us to have more engagement, more control, and also less impact from disempowering thought processes, which we all have. It's part of the human experience.
People often don't get the mental health services they need because they don't know where to start. Talk to your primary care doctor or another health professional about mental health problems. Ask them to connect you with the right mental health services. If you don't have a health professional who's able to assist you, then use these resources to find help for yourself, your friends, your family, or your students. If the situation is potentially life-threatening, get immediate emergency assistance by calling 911, available 24 hours a day. If you or someone you know is suicidal or in emotional distress, contact the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Trained crisis workers are available to talk 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Your confidential and toll-free call goes to the nearest crisis center in the Lifeline National Network. These centers provide crisis counseling and mental health referrals. Telephone hotlines are available in most areas of the U.S. to find free advice and help. In addition, online video counseling is available free of charge to those seeking professional help when and where in-person counseling is not available. An online video search can quickly uncover these valuable resources in times of crisis or by calling or texting 988. You can also find support for mental health issues by calling your local mental health clinic. They can set up an appointment to talk with you to see if counseling is recommended and to address your concerns. Also helpful is a close support network of friends and family. For those who are comfortable with faith-based support, you can also contact your local church or clergy for a referral to a professional counselor. American anxiety has become the hidden epidemic in our society, but with research tools and new discoveries available to those suffering from anxiety and depression, we are learning to manage these proliferating illnesses. We don't have a cure yet, but we are learning new ways to fight an age-old problem.